All right, welcome everybody to another edition of the Collaboration Podcast. I'm Jonathan K, and I'm here with my co-host Marco Masi, and we're continuing a conversation that we started on the last podcast with Bahman Shirazi. A little bit about the journal here. The Collaboration, now in its 49th year of publication, is a journal dedicated to the evolutionary vision of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Collaboration examines the theory and practice of integral yoga, the place of humankind in the universe, and themes such as consciousness, emergence, and transformation. Articles, essays, poetry, and images explore the human impulse towards perfection and speculate on future possibilities as we move forward in a rapidly changing world. And I'd just like to show we're going to be talking to Bahman about this issue here, the Divine Feminine, which is volume 48, number 1, spring 2023, and Bahman's article on called A Tribute to Jyotipriya.
We will put this also in the beginning of the YouTube video, so the listeners can see that directly. Okay, so I might begin with a question. The last time we spoke about the Soul of America, and this time, as Jonathan has pointed out, we are discussing an article of Bahman entitled A Tribute to Jyotipriya. And my first question, and almost instinctive question, is because I didn't know her, and also didn't read much about her, so I don't know much about her. My instinctive question is, did you know her, first of all? And in general, what motivated you to write this article?
Yes. No, I didn't know her personally because she died in 1980, and I probably hadn't even heard about integral yoga at that time. I did a few years later, a couple of years later. This issue of the Divine Feminine, I think, was something that we were planning for a while, and it's a very rich and profound concept because, as you know, Sri Aurobindo brings in, he brings in two aspects of Indian traditions that are complementary to each other, but have been studied separately: the Vedantic traditions and also the Tantric traditions. And the Tantric tradition is closer to the earth energies, the Shakti, and the feminine divine. And it's been something that has been integrated into integral yoga. At the same time, we all know that Sri Aurobindo and the Mother worked together as male and female, although they always said that their consciousness is the same. But that is a very unique thing in the history of spirituality, because in most cases that I know of, and there are not that many cases either, usually the female or consort is someone who is a supportive figure, someone who may have a very important role, but usually the man is always in front, and spiritual teachers have often been men, except for in the 20th century, that we have quite a few women teachers in different traditions. But this idea of the divine feminine and a yoga that brings the divine feminine into the earth consciousness and combines it with the supramental consciousness is so profound. So it has so many different dimensions to it. So when we were talking about how to do this issue, one of the things that came up, an aspect that came up, was maybe we should highlight one or two or maybe more integral yoginis, people that we know, or at least the integral yoga community knows. And we settled on two figures. One is Dr. Judith Tyberg, who are also known as Jyotipriya, and also Dakshina, who was the manager of the head of the center in Lodi. And I knew her very closely for many years, but Jyotipriya died in 1980, so that was before my time of knowing anything about integral yoga. So that's how we came to select Jyotipriya. We had some ideas about how to write this article. There was a person that we were in touch with named Mike Ashcraft, who had prepared a lot of facts and figures about her life, about Dr. Judith Tyberg's life, and but had written something that was, presentable or publishable. And we had hoped that he could maybe do that, but he backed out last minute. And I decided to do that because I felt I knew enough about her because of the connection that she had to the American Academy of Asian Studies and the founder of CIIS, Dr. Haridas Chaudhuri. And I had known about her for some time. And I also really wanted to know more about her. So this would have been an opportunity for me to do some research on her. There's not a lot about her, but there are some really good articles. Primarily, there's a Wikipedia article, which I believe is fairly good. It covers a lot of facts. It's quite objective, and it doesn't go into, a more sentimental approach, which one might like as a devotee of integral yoga, but it puts together a lot of the facts and what she did in her life very well. And the East-West Cultural Center that she founded has a website, and that website has a long biography. There was a dedication that was made to her a few years back, and I got a lot of my information from there. A lady called Mandakini, who is a biographer of Dr. Judith Tyberg, has contributed mostly to that website, and we actually had an opportunity to have an exchange with her. And when I finished the article, we ran it by her, and she was quite pleased with it. So I was happy that I'm not missing anything important or not doing justice, to her, not knowing her directly and not having studied her at depth. So yeah, that's how I came to that. I can maybe say more about that, but basically I did some research as far as I could, and I started writing, and it came together fairly well.
So let me just a little curiosity, because probably I have a doubt here that also others who are not acquainted with this center might have, because I see here the East-West Cultural and Educational Center. It's not this, right? It's another.
I don't think so. No, it's not actually at Sri Aurobindo Center in Los Angeles. It's still called East-West Cultural Center, but that's the name.
East-West Cultural Center, but yeah, okay.
Yes.
I will put eventually the link in the description, because it does not appear immediately on my search.
Yes, that would be nice. And I think if you actually can find on their website this tribute to her that has its own URL, maybe that can also be added, because she goes into a lot of detail that we didn't really have the time and space for in the journal.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the East-West Cultural Center is certainly known to the community of integral yoga folks in the United States, because they have participated in the OM conferences, which is the annual integral yoga conference. And the people who previously ran it, including Debashish Banerjee and others, are all people that are connected to the yoga, including the current members. So the integral community yoga really knows this center very well. it really has a very significant role to play in bringing the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, integral yoga, plus Indian spirituality to the United States. Maybe I should say a little bit about the history of that.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about
Okay.
the article or what I've covered in about her and her life. But I'll start with this. When I came to the Institute, at some point I saw, we learned about the fact that the Institute succeeded a previous institution that was founded in 1951 by Louis Gainsborough, who was a businessman, actually, who traveled to Asia a lot. He was interested in spirituality. He had interest in Sufism, I believe, and has written a book about that. But anyway, he, after the Second World War, he thought that, and he's written about this, there's a couple of articles that he put out to the general public, that the U.S. population doesn't really know much about Indian and Asian spirituality, and he was hoping to be able to facilitate a process, an educational process, to bring those teachings to the West. And apparently there was quite an openness to that right after the Second World War. I've heard that from Dr. Haridas Chaudhary. Dr. Judith Tyberg talks about how open people were in the early 50s. They really wanted to know about Indian spirituality, especially Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, who weren't very well known at all here. So this businessman, Louis Gainsborough, hires a Stanford professor called Frederick Spiegelberg, who had been to India, I believe a couple of different times, but I believe in the late 1940s, he was in India. And his mission was his goal of research was to search for the living traditions of India. So he'd gone around and met quite a few different spiritual teachers. And at the end of his process, he was introduced to Sri Aurobindo. I believe he might have been visiting Sri Ramana Maharshi, which is fairly close to Pondicherry, a few hours away. And they had suggested that he go down to Sri Aurobindo Ashram as well. So he goes down there, and he had a profound experience of Sri Aurobindo, and that really had a great impact on him. He wrote later about it that, Dr. Chaudhary talks about him wanting to first meet Sri Aurobindo in person, which wasn't possible because after 1938, Sri Aurobindo did not see anybody, as many people know, except a couple of companions of him, or caretakers and doctors. But he was able to actually attend a darshan, and he was a tall European man, and he could see above the heads of others, Sri Aurobindo and the Mother as part of the darshan. And during a moment, he felt that Sri Aurobindo had a glimpse and saw right through him, which made him aware of his soul. And he also wrote later that he had a huge healing experience at the same time, because he had certain kinds of nightmares most of his life that were totally healed. So he was truly impressed and wanted to have Sri Aurobindo's teachings brought to the U.S. And so when Spiegelberg came back to the U.S. from one of these trips, he actually started teaching some of Sri Aurobindo's books in the late 1940s at Stanford University. I actually eventually met or had a communication with a couple of the students who may not be alive anymore, but they were in their 80s when I talked to them. They had attended these early book reading sessions or whatever they were. They weren't classes yet. So Spiegelberg writes to Sri Aurobindo Ashram, and he asks about someone who could qualify, who's good at Western and Eastern philosophy, and they recommend Dr. Chaudhary at the end of that process. And at the same time, when he was in Pondicherry in 1949, he had met Jyotipriya or Dr. Judith Tyberg, who happened to be staying for a few months in Pondicherry before she came back to the United States after a 3-year stay in India. So I can say more about how that happened for her. But when Spiegelberg came back, he wrote to Jyotipriya, to Dr. Chaudhary, and to Alan Watts, and finally got this institution together. Jyotipriya was a Sanskrit teacher, so she taught there for about a couple of years, from 1951 to 1953, and then she went back down to Los Angeles and founded the East-West Cultural Center. Very much like the Cultural Integration Fellowship that Dr. Chaudhary founded a couple of years earlier. So they knew each other, and the two of them were the people that brought the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the mother to the United States and founded these two important cultural centers in San Francisco and Los Angeles areas. So that's, how, and the center has been there ever since, and it's done very well. Same with the Cultural Integration Fellowship.
And Bahman, did you want to speak a little bit more about the American Academy of Asian Studies, which kind of is the roots of even our connection? I'm a student at CIIS now, and you were earlier, but this would be another way of kind of bringing in the kind of the community, the centers in a way on the west coast of the States.
Yes, I can say a little bit more about that, and then it'd be good to go back to talk about who Dr. Judith Tyberg was and how she ended up eventually there, which I alluded to just right now. But so it's 1951, and this little academy gets started in San Francisco called the American Academy of Asian Studies. I've done a fair amount of research there because it lasted for about 18 years, roughly. It was very successful in the first few years. They had these Friday colloquia that are very famous. They had a great impact on the cultural life of San Francisco. It was just about the time that the beatniks were very active, the beat poets. And so people like Gary Snyder, as well as others like Michael Murphy, who was the founder of Esalen Institute. So people like them, as well as others, and some of whom I've been able to meet, attended these colloquia. And they say usually Spiegelberg was a moderator and Chaudhary was on the one side and Alan Watts was on the other. And they had these really warm and dynamic conversations. So these Friday colloquia were open to the public. They were not classes, but the academy was an actual institution, was an academic institution, and ran for a few years. And it was supported by Louis Gainsborough, who was a businessman. But unfortunately, after a couple of years, Gainsborough had some misfortune. What I believe happened was that he had an establishment of some kind of a factory or something in North Africa that went bankrupt because of an earthquake or something like that. There's different bits and pieces written about that. But that was a source of funding for this institution. So when the funding ceased, the institute went into a difficult period financially, and some of the people that were there felt that maybe they should think about having different venues for their teaching. So eventually Alan Watts in 1957 moved on and became well known in the San Francisco Bay Area through interviews that he had at KPFA radio and other talks that he gave. So he went his own way. Dr. Chaudhary was steadfast in holding the place. Judith Tyberg went back after a couple of years and she went down to Los Angeles. She was a Sanskrit teacher, and she was an excellent Sanskrit teacher and well-versed in Indian spirituality. She wasn't just a language teacher. She was a full scholar and had been a scholar for most of her life. So this institute eventually dwindles down after a few years, but it kept going for another decade or so. They tried to get accreditation, and as part of that, they ended up becoming part of the University of the Pacific. So eventually, their archives ended up at the University of the Pacific, and I had an opportunity to go there and research as much as I could, because there isn't really so much written about the academy, but it had a very profound impact on the intellectual and spiritual life of the San Francisco Bay Area. And eventually, some of the students of the academy asked Dr. Chaudhuri to start their own institution, so they ended up founding the California Institute of Asian Studies, which is now Institute of Integral Studies. So that's what the importance of that was. But that period of probably between 1951 and 1955 seems to be a really dynamic testing ground for Eastern spirituality in the U.S. So a lot of things get traced back to the energy that was going on at that time. Now, Judith Tyberg was born in 1902 to Theosophist parents who had, I believe, one was Dutch, one was Canadian, and they ended up in Southern California in the tip of the peninsula across from San Diego in a little town called Point Loma, which was the headquarters of the Theosophical Society there. And they wanted to experiment with a utopian society. So Jyotipriya's parents ended up there, moving there, and she was born there. And she grew up in an environment that was very rich, spiritually and educationally. And she had a very interesting upbringing. Some people say that the environment is as close as you can get to the idea of an education that nurtures the soul, the psychic being. So she showed a lot of potential from the very beginning. And so she spent much of her youth growing up there. She ended up going to the Theosophical University, got her master's and PhD degrees there. She studied with a teacher there who was a teacher of Sanskrit. So she did quite a few years of in-depth study of Sanskrit. And it turns out that she was a little bit suspect about the interpretations of Sanskrit texts and spiritual texts of India from Western translators and some of the sources that she was exposed to. And she decided, well, in 1947, I believe it was, Professor Radhakrishnan, who was the chancellor, vice chancellor of Banaras Hindu University, happened to be in Southern California, I believe, gave a talk at U.S.A. on campus there. And that's how Judith Tyberg met him, and wrote a letter to him the following year, wanted to come there and study at the Banaras Hindu University. And that connection made it possible for her. And she broke away from the Theosophical Society. There was a change in leadership, and she didn't really believe that the people that were running the place were really well suited for the kinds of visions that she had. So in 1946 and 47, she became independent and ran a bookshop and gave lectures and taught Sanskrit and Indian spirituality, kind of a precursor to what she ended up doing later when she got back to the US. But in 1947, she went to Benares and studied there for about 3 years. And as part of the faculty there was a person who knew about Sri Aurobindo, And as part of a conversation, when she was talking about her dissatisfaction about interpretation of the Vedic literature, for example, and so on, this professor, Aurobindo Basu, who was, one of the people that knew Sri Aurobindo and happened to have a pre-published copy and maybe some manuscript or maybe an early version before it became available of The Secret of the Veda book, which is a crucial study of Vedic symbolism and the importance of the depth that was missed by Western scholars, and even some of the Indian scholars thought that these were primitive, more symbolic language and teachings, but it turns out to be, as Sri Aurobindo discovered, very profound teachings that were just put in those symbolic ways. And when she reads this book, she probably, I believe she stayed up all night and finished the book. She totally realizes this is exactly what she was looking for all her life. So she writes to Sri Aurobindo and the mother. I think Aurobindo Basu facilitated that. And eventually she goes down and meets Sri Aurobindo, the mother, during a darshan. And after she got done with her studies in 1949, she lived in the Pondicherry ashram for about 3 months, perhaps. And then in March of 1951 or 1950, she comes back to the United States. And then Spiegelberg, who had met her, I've seen letters exchanged between them, a couple of different letters at least, where Spiegelberg talks about Sri Aurobindo, and so it seemed to me that they knew each other just from being in India and being around Sri Aurobindo ashram. And so she gets invited to join the academy later. So that was a profound period of, she was an excellent student. There are so many people that have written praises about her scholarship and depth of her knowledge, her teaching abilities. It's just a dynamic soul, but she had a profound experience, just like Frederick Spiegelberg did when she went to darshan with Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And she describes it in almost similar ways. For example, she says that she felt that there's an energy that was coming from Sri Aurobindo that stretched to infinity, that the consciousness, the power was so strong that even though she had soul aspirations most of her life, that during that moment, she actually knew, she got to know about her soul directly, almost like soul realization through a darshan. And so this was life-changing for her, and she became a devotee of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And when she got back to the United States, she was almost magically, in some of the letters that she wrote to some of the people in the Pondicherry ashram, she was describing that she couldn't keep up with how many invitations she got to give lectures and talks. Just imagine, she's back, she's not part of any institution, and she's just getting left and right these invitations. And then she gets invited to go up to San Francisco Bay Area and gives talks at Stanford University and other places. And so there was just some force that was behind the spread of what she was doing and the teachings that she was bringing to the US. And then eventually she gets another opportunity in 1972. That was the centennial of Sri Aurobindo's birth. He was born in 1872, so this was 1972. And there were huge celebrations around the world. And she went back and actually was able to be present before the mother left her body in 1973. So she had a great experience and came back. And a few years later, in 1980, she also passed away. But she put together this center that was a place of cultural exchange, bringing spirituality, scholarship, teaching language, philosophy, comparative religion. I mean, just a marvelous center, and it's still going on to the day. And so it was blessed by Shurban and the mothers. Same with the work of Dr. Chaudhary, and so we can see that they're still alive and going forward. So I think that she deserves to be known a little bit better. She even deserves to be known much better as an American woman in the field of spirituality beyond Shurban and the mother circle, and just who she was, the dynamism that she had, the depth of knowledge, the work that she did, and the connections that she had. East-West Cultural Center, same with Cultural Integration Fellowship in San Francisco, were two places where most of the Indian gurus in the 1950s and 60s came and stayed and gave their introductory talks. So they were very instrumental in bringing the Eastern teachings to the West, not just Shurban and the mother's teachings. So various swamis would come and stay with Shurban, stay at Shurban centers, and then from there they would find followings and so on. So by the time we're in the 60s, decade or decade and a half, Indian spirituality is almost like second nature to the progressive hippies and other intellectuals in the U.S. So she had a crucial role in bringing the teachings to the West.
I may also just a little information that I just discovered now. On the Wikipedia page, there are also audio recordings of her. So I didn't listen to it and can't say much about that, but also an interesting thing that I will make after this this interview. And by the way, another thing that I found absolutely fascinating is you hinted a bit at that about her education, which already began before her birth. So what's about that? I might read it from the article, and that according to the East-West Cultural Center's website, all throughout the 9 months of Jyotipriya's gestation in the womb, her mother chanted a Vedic hymn to the newly embodied soul. At an early age, Jyotipriya could recite sections of the Gita by heart. I found this so beautiful, wonderful. I would love to have such an education before my birth.
Yeah, I think that, and you don't find this in the Wikipedia page, right?
Yes,
I mean, part of this is just a matter of fact that theosophists were big on Indian spirituality, even though there was a certain level of Western interpretation and so maybe a little bit of cultural filtering that was going on. But theosophists were really interested in integrating East and West, science and spirituality. They were really progressive people. Although it started in late 19th century, this center in Point Loma got started around the turn of the century, just a couple of years, I think, before, 2-3 years before Jyotipriya was born. But that would be exactly the kind of thing that they would be doing, like Sanskrit chanting and things like that. Raja Yoga, like they had a school of Raja Yoga for children, and Jyotipriya taught for a decade or so in that school. So you have that environment. But I believe she was actually a very evolved soul. The mother had told her that she had this divine service to the divine in her for many, many lifetimes. Sri Raman Maharshi had told her that she was already enlightened and she just didn't know it yet, you know. So I think we're really talking about a different order of teachers and spiritual practitioners than the ordinary. You know, I believe Haridas Chaudhuri was also similar in that way. You know, these were people who actually had spiritual experiences and a life of dedication and service. So really, a true practitioner, a true yogi, sharp intellect, depth knowledge, you know, of Eastern and especially Indian, you know, teachings before even you get to Sri Aurobindo. So Jyotipriya learned about Sri Aurobindo in about late 1940s. So she was kind of a latecomer actually to that. But before that, she was quite steeped in Sanskrit studies. She was actually very innovative. One of her first books, she and her teacher had the first linotype printing of Devanagari handwriting, you know. So that was the first book in the West that, or probably even ever, I'm not even sure if in India that technology existed. They developed, you know, how to type with typeset with Devanagari script, you know. So the book came out like that. Nowadays it's you know, common. You see Devanagari script for Sanskrit. So, you know, she was quite an innovator too. So yeah, multi-dimensional person, just a genius, really.
Yeah, great.
Bahman, I have a quick question about, excuse me, about if you could speak a little bit about Loma land, because I mean this, and does it still exist, or I'm just wondering about its history a little bit, because in the integral yoga community here, there's Oroville, which is really the experimental, you know, place in which integral yoga is embarking upon a kind of a utopian praxis in a way. And so I was just wondering, I've never heard of anybody compare or contrast or even discuss Loma land before. I'd just like to know more about it. And if you can relate some of its principles, similarities and differences from what we have in Oroville.
You know, I'm not really the right person to do that. You probably need someone with a good background in theosophy. I had some interest in theosophy, and I read about Loma land. But, you know, there was, as I mentioned to you, there was a kind of a breakdown in that there was a change in leadership and someone came in and a schism was created, and then they moved the headquarters of the Theosophical Society into Los Angeles area somewhere. And so I believe that whole community kind of fell apart, although the campus is still there and there's a university that took its place. I'm not sure exactly what they're teaching, but the sort of experimental community is no longer there. You know, that didn't last very long. I mean, it did last for a few decades, you know, but from, let's say, 1900 to 1945, I think that was the life of it. But I don't really know a lot more about that, unfortunately, to tell you. I read about it, you know, as I was researching Jyotipriya, and I got interested in site readings. But, you know, again, those are things you just absorb peripherally. I'm not really in a place to really know what's going on there or what was really going on there. But it seemed to be a very fascinating environment as I was reading about it. You know, they had schools for children. They had, you know, theosophical activities. So very rich with Eastern and Western spirituality lectures, karma yoga type functions, you know. So it was a good community, but I think it started to fall apart as people changed and leadership changed.
you have a long-lasting expertise in integral psychology. And this is a subject that I have heard so many times, because I'm not a psychologist, but this comes up over and over again that there is this integral psychology. And my impression was always that it is neither a Western nor a Eastern kind of psychology, but something that tries to harmonize, to integrate it. As the word says, it is an integral psychology. But what it really distinguishes from Aurobindo's writings as such, and what it distinguishes from the Western psychology, this I intuitively, it's much clearer. But in what sense does integral psychology differ from the teachings of Shoyabindo and the mother? And what is there more or less than that? And I was also interested a bit in the situation. How far did this movement go? Is it still alive? And so on. So more in general terms, maybe a little historical introduction, tell us where it is now and what it is about. No.
Yes, sure. Well, you know, integral psychology, apparently the terminology was coined by Dr. Indra Sen, who was a psychologist in India, mostly interested in Western and especially depth psychology, Jungian psychology, and so on. He is the father of Oster Patel. I don't know if you know Oster. She's an Orwellian senior member there. I've learned a lot about this directly from her. But in the 1940s, somewhere maybe in the mid-1940s, after a few years of living in the Sri Aurobindo ashram, Indra Sen approaches Sri Aurobindo and says, I see a whole psychological system in your teachings. You know, is it okay if we start, maybe I can start writing and teaching about integral psychology? You know, that's the question to him. And Sri Aurobindo apparently says something to the effect of the famous saying that yoga is nothing but practical psychology. So he basically says, of course, yeah, this is exactly a kind of psychology that is based in experience, and all my teachings are based in that. The framing of his teachings as he spoke and as he mostly wrote, right? But as he expanded on his experiences, he created frameworks that were metaphysical, that had connection to basic Indian teachings in so many different ways. But the idea was to extract the psychological framework out of the metaphysical teachings, you know, so take out the metaphysical language as much as possible. So this methodology is actually used in other sacred psychologies. You can do this with Buddhist psychology. You can do it with Sufi psychology, et cetera, right? So you go into a system which is huge. Buddhism is everything, is from anthropology to psychology to philosophy to religion to theology to, you know, there's so many dimensions to a huge religion like that, right? But you go in there with a psychological lens, and that's basically, from an academic point of view, your methodology. And you extract, or you see with that lens, certain aspects that you could use in different ways, or you could put out in different ways, you know. So that was the beginning of integral psychology. That was an integral psychology initiated by Indra Sen, and started teaching them in the 1940s in workshops in Pondicherry. Now, there were two other integral psychologies, at least, you know, I've heard of others as well, but in the 1960s and 70s, Dr. Haridas Chaudhuri was also interested in integral psychology, and he started developing his own unique approach. He was teaching in the West, and he was interested in making a connection to Western psychologies and Western teaching. So he made a bridge between that and humanistic and transpersonal psychology that was developing just about that time in the mid to late 60s and into the 70s. So, that was the second approach. That was a unique approach in the sense that it does not rely much or at all, really, on the metaphysical framework of Sri Aurobindo. Doesn't use that terminology. Dr. Chaudhuri created his own terminology. So, for example, he had a triadic principle that he called uniqueness, relatedness, transcendence. So this is sort of parallel to the three modes of consciousness: individual, universal, and transcendent. But he uses them in a different way, but it's principally the same concepts that he can use in a psychological framework. Or he has these 12 or plus principal tenets of integral psychology. He lays down certain foundations. We could talk about these maybe at some other time. And then there was also Ken Wilber, who started writing closer to 1980. So his approach was different. It was mostly intellectual, and the orientation that he took, even though he says that he was inspired by Sri Aurobindo and so on, but he was sort of everything under the sun interpretation of integral, So there are criticisms of that, because integral is not, everything, it's not a theory of everything, or it's not the consciousness of everything. Like, I don't imagine that if someone is in an integral state of consciousness, even temporarily, that they would count the number of molecules in a, in a vial of some chemical,
It's not the sum of the parts.
It's irrelevant, actually. So basically, there are these three basic approaches, and we should recognize them. I've always recognized them in at least sort of saying that they're out there. So, but the key thing for me is, and Chaudhuri and Indra Sen both emphasize this, they call it the psychology of the whole person, and I think that's a key definition, because psychology, by its definition, was always limited to the methodology that was used. In the West, there was no psychology before 1875. Before that, we had philosophy of mind, right? And so a philosophical lens was what was creating the discourse on matters that we call psychology today. And then starting with the first movement, the experimental or scientific movement in Germany, for example, we had that first school of psychology, and then we had the second and third and the fourth waves, and those are basically the experimental, empirical one. And we had depth psychology, which came out with Freud and Jung and Assagioli and a few others. And then we had humanistic psychology with Maslow and others, and then transpersonal psychology that was then going into the Eastern teachings to kind of bring out those teachings into the West. So the closest you come to in the West is transpersonal psychology. But there's also interesting research done by some of the CIIS faculty in recent years that the whole movement of transpersonal psychology, which started in 1965 or 66, went through many iterations, and eventually they picked up a whole person framework. I can send you an article if you're interested about various definitions of integral psychology and how eventually they came around to this whole person definition. So today, integral psychology and transpersonal psychology in its latest version are very close systems that look at the whole person, rather than just the depth psychology or just the behavioral aspect or just this or just that, So very exciting. I tend to want to think of it as the fifth movement in psychology. And in some ways, it should be the last movement in psychology because it brings everything together, but it's not officially out there. Nobody's necessarily saying this. So just something that could possibly happen. So to answer your question, integral psychology started to take a new life after Chaudhary in the late 1990s and early 2000. There have been about 7 or 8 conferences of it that I've been part of mostly. And so these conferences sort of revived it, and there's literature that now we have. There hasn't been any conferences in recent years, but I think a lot of people are still interested. But one last thing I want to say is that this is the kind of psychology that will find its way, the essential teachings of this kind of psychology find its way into other fields and other areas. So it's not really possible to keep a framework for integral psychology intact forever as an isolated or insular, system that, nothing, because it's so inclusive in some way, but the entryways to it is from many channels, but the way that you deal with it is sensitively and methodologically important. So that's really where everything sits, but primarily it's the psychology of experience of various states of consciousness and how they can come together, and what is the unifying element in the human being that can do that work. So that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, I feel the importance of the psychic being, the notion of the psychic being. We can call it also just the soul, but as we have already a bit discussed last time, there's a very different concept in the notion of the soul in integral yoga than what we can see in Western psychology, if it accepts the idea of the soul at all. But
Not
even
much,
when
yeah.
it accepts, it's something still very different and very dry, I would say, than what we have in integral psychology. And this is something that, I feel is deeply missing also in other contexts, that, as you said, in education, the idea of education where you create an environment where you don't put knowledge, intellectual knowledge into the child, but you create the environment that the soul's child can develop.
Right, exactly.
But if you have this idea that the soul is something static, that does not change, that does not evolve, you don't understand this concept.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
No, you're quite right. In the West, the idea of soul, of course, comes mostly from either Greek philosophers, before Christianity, or Neoplatonists and so on. And then, in the Middle Ages, in the Andalusian environment, some of these teachings were handed down later, but eventually it becomes a Christian concept or a Jewish concept or a Muslim concept. And then, in the 20th century, the methodological limitations that were put by positivistic thinking basically kicked the soul out of the picture. The only breathing channel that was left, which was good, was people like William James started to write about self as a kind of a deeper center of selfhood, something that alluded to the same concepts, maybe not using the same word. And also people like Carl Jung, they definitely used it. They used other terminology to refer to it, but Jung also wrote a book called Modern Man in Search of a Soul, So, and same thing with Roberto Assagioli. He was an Italian psychiatrist who knew Freud and Jung, and he developed Jung's model further into a higher unconscious as opposed to a lower unconscious, and made it more comprehensive. But he also was very aware of how the word soul was used. But essentially, I think the misconception is that the soul is some kind of an energy that leaves the body when you die, and so that kind of thinking about soul makes it sort of intangible, something that nobody can experience directly. You have it, but you don't have access to it, and then it leaves the body and somehow goes to another state of consciousness. So it's all very vague. I don't think that most traditions have done that much. There are some fairly good details in Sufi and Kabbalist traditions about the various aspects of the soul, but there's nothing so clearly laid out in terms of the three aspects of the soul in Sri Aurobindo's system.
Yeah, the Sufi also had this idea. It was not an evolutionary idea, but they spoke of the soul in the heart, something like that. I don't remember now. They perhaps were those who more closely developed something like that. But yeah. I think we need that in our, not only in psychology, in our collective consciousness. Right? The idea of the soul as an evolving being. One must not necessarily relate it to Sri Aurobindo or whatever, but this is something that, and because this, once we accept this idea, it has logical consequences in our doing, in our everyday life, and also in conceiving, for example, education, psychology, everything. The history of the human history itself becomes a representation, an outer expression of an evolution of a collective soul, something like that. No, so this is absolutely fascinating. I could speak about that for hours. And
no, you're right. I think one of the challenges is that, well, first of all, yes, integral psychology absolutely needs the soul, but it also needs to deal with the ego. So you need to understand the connection between the two. Same thing exists in Jungian psychology and in psychosynthesis. So these three systems, I think I would pick them as systems of psychology that are on the right path. They're moving in a direction of a psychology that understands the soul. But the soul is an intuitive element, I think, in all human beings. We all have a connection to it, but we cannot interpret it through our mind. We cannot understand it through our mind, which is used to dealing with the external world, right? The brain and the nervous system and the five senses and the kind of interaction of brain-mind, that kind of activity in consciousness is always getting its clues from the external world. And it just doesn't have the vocabulary for intuitive knowledge of the soul, which we all have. And in people who have a strong sense of it, it actually, they know that there's something, that there's more to us than what we usually think. Or they're poets or philosophers or, people that are just energized, and they know that there's something of a dynamic center in us. There's just no terminology to describe it because it always fails when you're trying to bring vocabulary from the external world to try to, do that. So integral psychology is in a good place to deal with this, and also with the problems of egocentric consciousness, which is so guarded and suppressive of soul consciousness. That's another real challenge of any yoga and any yoga psychology, is to really understand. So I think the importance of integral psychology is a psychology that helps with the process of spiritual development,
Yeah. Yeah.
because without a psychological understanding of the inner dynamics between the ego and the soul and other variables that are involved, we are more likely to do spiritual bypassing or some other dead end process than to actually grow and evolve, in accordance to the dictates of the spirit.
Yeah, we must also be open-minded to this, because in our materialistic conception, our materialistic society, we are just only a brain. Essentially, I am my brain, there's nothing less. This is the physicalism. It's one of my preferred subjects of discussion. And my hero, in a sense, is William James, who said, the brain, we are also allowed to conceive the brain as a prism that refracts the light of consciousness, but does not produce it, or as a channel that transceives consciousness, but does not produce it. And there are a lot of things that could be said about that. But as long as we are in this materialistic mindset that believes only in biochemistry, in molecules, in brains, and nothing else, there I think we have the stumbling block, where we can get from there to some more evolved, even psychology and more spiritual psychology, where also all these dimensions of the soul are also considered.
Yes.
Yeah, I could jump in for a second on that point, because I think that's super right, Marco. And if you go back to like even the root of the word psyche, Greek is soul. And so in early Greek times, there was a much broader question about what we started calling psychology at a certain time, at a time when discipline started to be created in Europe, in the formation of the modern academy, when things started to silo apart. And there's a whole like important history to consider, I think, in how we produce knowledge in modernity based on a lot of assumptions that come from the time of the Enlightenment, where in earlier times, like in the time of even Aristotle, he, I think, according to certain readings, a friend of mine and a philosopher, Jack Bagby, is really engaged in kind of a minor reading of Aristotle, which really is problematizing this idea of the soul or psyche. It's central to his questions, yet he doesn't necessarily fall down on one side to say it is a static entity like a Platonic form. He's bringing in the idea of, well, there is this kind of this beingness, this transcendentness, there is this becomingness, and according to the minor reading of Jack, Aristotle at times, yes, is going to kind of push us in one direction, but he also is going to kind of keep things open. And as you mentioned, Bahman, we go through into the theological times, we go into the transposition of how is it that the transcendent is kind of utilized as a kind of like the master signifier in knowledge production. Then we have this idea of a mediation between a soul and the humans. And I think this all has to do with how is it that we started creating the discipline of psychology. And it also brings up certain violences that psychology as a discipline does to humans, because it reduces human behavior, humans, to some kind of normative structures, whether it's Freudianism, even extends all the way through to any type of discipline which kind of claims absolute authority to talk about somebody's psychological state. And the whole problem that I see is that we're really, like you're saying, Marco, basing this analysis on a quantitative analysis through the mechanism and the rigor of science, which is very important. But what happens when we give up the qualitative aspects, the right to every human to have a qualitative singularity, uniqueness? It's not reducible to any kind of quantity. And I think that this is it's a very complex situation that, in the end, I think, Bahman, like you sort of mentioned, there is going to be a type of disciplinary consistency, or the integral psychology, for instance, is going to have some kind of an inner consistency. Yet, I don't think that you can really, I don't think that we can, this is my opinion, continue to separate out the idea of psychology from the idea of metaphysics, which are kind of encapsulated within some of the questions, or from the question of science, which really is giving us apparatus and methods and models to think and try to build collective futures, so we're not just trapped in the fact that, well, I have my own qualitative uniqueness and it can't be translated. So I think that it's a really, really big question, a really big field of studies that includes questions from all of these. And it's kind of like, at this point in time, kind of, in my studies anyway, in my critical studies of psychology with Debashish at CIIS, is kind of getting beyond this disciplinary centrism that we kind of create in the academy, also trying to parse out some of the you could say some of the more kind of colonial structures that are part of knowledge production from a Eurocentric or Euro-American centric point of view. And I think integral yoga psychology has that aspiration to kind of be something that isn't bound to one culture or another, but how is it that we can engage in a productive, problematic, that doesn't reduce one thing to the next, that can actually have some kind of a qualitative openness to whatever it is that somebody is developing in their own practice of psychocosmology or spirituality and whole person health, but also have these kind of like connections to others in terms of a quantitative way of sharing these experiences. So a little bit from my perspective, but this is super beautiful conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, the more we talk about this, I keep thinking about so many different things that can come into this conversation. So it's absolutely something to follow up on when you feel ready for doing that. And
yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
I won't say any more because we're out of time, but I just totally agree with a lot of what was said. And so
we can continue the conversation in a third podcast, no? If you agree.
Okay.
Yeah,
sure.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, both
Great.
of you.
Yes.
Thank you,
Another
Bahman.
good afternoon for me.
And thanks.
Thank you,
Looking
Jonathan.
forward to seeing you. Take care.
All right.
Have a nice time.
You well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.